Okay, so this week you guys shared Jordan Peterson's "You Should Be a Monster" video with us for the deep dive.
Yeah.
And I got to say, the title alone,
It grabs
it's
you.
like, whoa, hold on, what's going on here? But today we're going to try to cut straight to the point of his message and figure out, what's he really saying about how to become a more capable person in the world.
I think that's a great way to put it.
So let's dive in.
Sounds good.
All right, so right off the bat, Peterson jumps into this idea that we all have to recognize and really wrestle with the darker sides of ourselves.
Right from the start.
Yeah, he uses some pretty strong language, too, talking about, like, satanic tendencies.
Yeah.
To emphasize that these aren't just, little quirks or flaws, but something much deeper and kind of fundamental to being human that we can't afford to just brush under the rug.
Right, and that language is so intentional because he wants to shake people out of complacency.
Totally. And I think it works because you can't, hearing that phrase, satanic tendencies, you kind of have to stop and think.
It's like, wait a minute, what is he talking about?
Exactly. So what's the benefit of actually facing these negative parts of ourselves head on? What does he say happens if we don't?
Well, he argues that avoiding that kind of internal confrontation leaves us incredibly vulnerable. We end up ill-equipped to deal with the tougher parts of reality.
Okay.
And we become sort of naive about the potential for people to take advantage of us, which then breeds this resentment and this sense of being victimized.
Oh, I see. So it's almost like you're setting yourself up for those experiences by not being prepared.
Exactly. It's about understanding that those darker impulses exist both within us and in the world around us.
Okay, so then it's not actually about becoming a monster in the literal sense, but more about acknowledging the potential for that within us.
Yeah, I think that's a really important distinction to make because the word monster is so loaded.
Yeah, for sure. So what's the upside then of engaging with this, what's it called, the shadow self?
Yeah, that's the term that's often used for those darker aspects.
Okay.
So the upside is that it can actually become a source of strength, almost like a kind of contained power.
Interesting.
Peterson uses the analogy of someone who's highly skilled in martial arts.
Okay.
They possess the ability to do serious harm, but that very capability held in check radiates confidence.
Right, because they could hurt you, but they choose not to.
Precisely, and that earns respect not just from others, but also from themselves.
Self-respect, that's a good point.
It's not about being weak or passive, but having that potential and knowing how to control it.
I like that martial arts analogy. It really highlights that having the capacity for something doesn't automatically mean you have to use it.
Yeah, it's about conscious choice.
And he even contrasts this with the idea of just being harmless, right? He uses a rabbit as an example.
Yeah, the rabbit is harmless simply because it lacks the capacity to be anything else.
Right, it's not making a choice.
Exactly. And Peterson argues that true virtue arises from being capable of harmful actions, but choosing not to commit them.
So the choice is what makes it virtue.
That's his definition.
That's a really interesting distinction.
Yeah, it's challenging the idea that virtue is just about being passive or innocent.
Right, it's more complex than that.
Definitely, and this leads into another one of Peterson's key points, which is the idea of the monster hero.
Oh yeah, he uses Harry Potter as an example, right?
Exactly. He talks about how Harry breaks rules and even has this ability to talk to sneaks, which is often viewed with suspicion and fear.
Right, like Parseltongue.
Yeah, and what's interesting is how Peterson uses these figures to show that even the people we consider heroes often have a kind of monster element to them.
A darker side.
Yeah, a side that operates outside of the conventional norms or possesses these inherently dangerous traits.
And it's not necessarily a bad thing.
Right. It's about understanding that true strength and the ability to overcome challenges might require tapping into that darker potential.
Like in Harry's case, his ability to speak Parseltongue is ultimately what helps him defeat Voldemort.
Exactly. It's this willingness to venture beyond pure goodness and tap into that more complex side of himself that allows him to succeed.
He also brings up Batman, another hero who's kind of defined by his darkness and brooding nature.
Right. He's not your typical bright and cheery superhero.
No, not at all.
And Peterson argues that this idea of the hero with the monster aspect is a recurring theme throughout mythology.
Oh, wow, like in those classic stories of heroes descending into the underworld and battling monsters.
Exactly. It suggests this fundamental understanding that to confront and defeat evil, sometimes you have to acknowledge and integrate that potential within yourself.
That's pretty deep.
Yeah, it goes beyond those simplistic notions of good versus evil.
So then Peterson also talks about this idea of the will to win and even the will to hurt, at least in principle, especially in like competitive situations.
Yeah, that's where things get really interesting.
Because that sounds kind of intense.
It is he's basically saying that in those unavoidable competitive scenarios, like a fight, you need the desire to win.
Okay.
And that underlying capacity to inflict harm.
Right, because if you go into a fight without any will to win, you're probably going to lose.
Exactly. But he's also very clear that the intention behind that capacity is what separates it from evil.
So it's not about being malicious.
No, it's about having the ability to defend yourself or achieve a necessary goal, but not letting that power corrupt you.
So it's like having the tools, even the dangerous ones, but knowing how to use them responsibly.
Exactly. And he views this whole process of coming to terms with that darker side of ourselves as a crucial step towards a more complete understanding of who we are.
Okay, so it's not just about being positive and happy all the time.
No, he's challenging those simplistic views of personal growth.
And this kind of leads him to critique what he sees as a modern imbalance, right? This overemphasis on rights without a corresponding focus on responsibility.
Yeah, that's a huge part of his message.
He says we've gotten so caught up in talking about our rights that we've kind of forgotten about the importance of responsibility.
And he sees that as a real problem.
So why does he think responsibility is so vital?
Well, he believes that taking on responsibility is the primary way we discover genuine meaning and develop resilience in life.
Okay, so it's not just about feeling good,
No, it's about something deeper.
like having a sense of purpose.
Exactly. He contrasts the kind of fleeting nature of happiness and pleasure with the more lasting satisfaction that comes from shouldering burdens.
Like what kind of burdens?
Things like caring for yourself, your family, your community, pursuing truth.
Right, those things that give you a sense of purpose and connection.
Yeah, and he argues that those responsibilities actually ground us and equip us to deal with the inevitable hardships that life throws our way.
It's like having a solid foundation.
Exactly.
And this ties into his point about reclaiming masculine competence without automatically associating it with tyranny.
Yeah, this is a really important one, especially in today's world.
I think so too, because it feels like there's so much discussion right now about masculinity and what it means.
Absolutely. And Peterson's critique is that we've developed this tendency to immediately equate masculine strength and capability with oppression,
Like if a man is assertive or ambitious, he must be trying to dominate everyone.
right? And he argues that this is incredibly damaging, not just for men, but for everyone.
Yeah, it creates all sorts of problems.
So he's really emphasizing the importance of becoming competent and dangerous in the sense of being capable and effective in the world.
Not dangerous in a bad way.
Right. It's about having the skills and the strength to face challenges.
And he contrasts this with the idea of weakness and incapacity,
Yeah, he sees that as a recipe for disaster.
because it makes you more vulnerable to being taken advantage of.
Exactly. And it can also breed resentment and even violence.
That's a good point.
He brings up some pretty stark examples like school shootings, suggesting a link between feeling powerless and lashing out.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So he's really pushing back against the idea that men should just be passive, harmless.
And this whole idea of competence and responsibility also connects to his reinterpretation of that biblical phrase, the meek shall inherit the earth.
Oh, yeah, he has a very different take on that than most people.
Right, the common understanding is that it's praising the humble and the weak.
But Peterson argues that the original meaning of meek is closer to something like those who have the power but choose to restrain it.
Like they could use violence, but they choose not to.
Exactly. It's about power under control, not inherent weakness.
So it's more about self-discipline.
Yeah, and he actually sees the modern tendency to encourage young men to be naive, weak, and harmless as a really bad idea.
Because he says, and this is a pretty blunt statement, someone who's incapable of cruelty is just a victim waiting to happen.
It's a harsh truth.
Yeah, but it makes you think.
And he connects this to our fascination with anti-heroes and villains in stories.
Oh, that's interesting.
He suggests that there's this subconscious desire within us to acknowledge and integrate that monster element as a source of strength and self-respect.
Like we're drawn to those characters because they embody something that we're missing.
Yeah, and he argues that until we develop teeth, so to speak, that capacity for harm, it's really hard to demand respect from ourselves and others.
It's like you have to know your own strength in order to be taken seriously.
Right, and it's not about actually using that strength to hurt people, but about having it there as a kind of foundation.
So this monstrousness, this capacity for harm, it's not about unleashing it, but about controlling it.
Exactly.
And he even goes so far as to say that this can be a foundation for peace.
Yeah, that's one of the more surprising parts of his argument.
How so?
Well, he's saying that the confidence that comes from knowing you're capable can actually deter people from trying to take advantage of you.
Like if you project an aura of strength.
Exactly. It's almost like a natural defense mechanism.
So it's the opposite of weakness inviting aggression.
Right. He's suggesting that true peace comes from strength, not from being passive.
And he ties all of this back to Jung and the idea of shadow integration.
Yeah, that's a really important concept.
And Jung believed that confronting those hellish aspects of ourselves, the parts we'd rather not acknowledge,
The stuff we try to hide.
right, that's actually essential for understanding the capacity for really terrible things that we see in others.
Yeah, it's about recognizing the potential for darkness within ourselves in order to understand it in the world around us.
And he uses some pretty extreme examples to illustrate this point, right? Like Nazi Germany and Stalin's Soviet Union.
Exactly. He's saying that without this self-awareness, we remain blind to these fundamental aspects of human nature.
So we're not really being honest with ourselves about who we are.
Right, and that lack of honesty makes it impossible to control those tendencies.
It's like you can't fix a problem if you don't even acknowledge that it exists.
Exactly, and he contrasts this whole difficult process of shadow integration with that more simplistic idea of just following your bliss.
Yeah, like just focusing on being happy and positive.
Right, he's saying it's much more complicated than that.
And then there's this other seemingly paradoxical idea that acknowledging our potential for evil can actually lead to a greater sense of self-respect.
Yeah, that's a tough one to wrap your head around.
It does seem counterintuitive.
It is, but he's suggesting that recognizing the full scope of our capabilities, both the light and the dark, can foster a deeper and more realistic form of self-respect.
Like we're respected the totality of who we are, not just the parts we like.
Exactly, and he compares it to the respect we might feel for a powerful animal.
Likely.
It's about understanding that power can be dangerous, but it can also be awe-inspiring.
That's a really interesting analogy.
And finally, he brings all of this back to the practical matter of disciplining children.
Oh yeah, that part was really fascinating.
Yeah, he's saying that if parents really understand their own potential for being a monster, for losing their tension, or being unfair.
It makes them more motivated to guide their kids away from those behaviors that might trigger that darker side.
Exactly. It encourages a more proactive approach to parenting.
And he also talks about those subtler forms of parental monstrousness, like undermining a child's courage.
Right. It's not always about physical punishment.
No, sometimes it's more psychological.
Exactly. And he even touches on that Freudian idea of parental revenge if a child doesn't show proper respect.
Woo, that's pretty heavy.
Yeah, he's getting at some deep psychological stuff there.
And he ends like saying that we're either mastering our own monster or being controlled by it.
It's a powerful way to sum up his whole argument.
So to kind of bring it all together, Peterson's call to be a monster, it's not actually about being cruel or destructive.
No, it's much more nuanced than that.
It's really an argument for developing competent strength and the ability to stand up for yourself.
And to do all of that while maintaining self-control and choosing not to be monstrous.
Right. It's about having those teeth but choosing not to bite.
Exactly. And he's suggesting that this integration of our dark side can actually be a source of self-respect, resilience, and even peace.
It's a really challenging idea, but it's also incredibly thought-provoking.
And that's what makes Peterson so compelling.
Definitely. So for everyone listening, I want you to think about what aspects of your own shadow you might be overlooking.
Yeah, what parts of yourself are you maybe trying to suppress or deny?
And how could acknowledging and integrating those aspects instead of pushing them away contribute to your own strength and ability to navigate the world?
It's a question worth reflecting on.
What would it look like for you to have those teeth but consciously choose not to bite?
That's the real challenge.
It is, and it's a challenge that I think is worth taking on.
I agree.
All right, well, that's our deep dive into Jordan Peterson's You Should Be a Monster video.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for being here, and we'll see you next time.
See you then.
Bye.